Captain Marcus Chen stood at the observation deck of Earth's newest space station, watching the sleek alien vessels approach through the star field. His weathered hands gripped the railing as he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Beside him, his daughter Sarah sat motionless in her advanced wheelchair, her green eyes fixed on the same view that had captivated her father. Sarah had been paralyzed from the waist down since birth, due to a rare genetic condition that Earth's medical technology couldn't fully repair. Despite her physical limitations, her mind was sharp as a laser blade, and she had become one of humanity's most brilliant xenolinguists at just 22 years old. She spoke 7 alien languages fluently and had helped establish peaceful contact with 4 different species. The approaching fleet belonged to the Zephyrian Empire, a proud race of beings who resembled tall, elegant reptiles with iridescent scales that shifted color based on their emotions. Their leader, Baron Kessatar, had requested this meeting to discuss a new trade agreement between their species and humanity. Earth desperately needed the rare minerals that the Zephyrians controlled, while the aliens were interested in human technology and cultural exchanges. Marcus had been chosen to lead the negotiations because of his military background and diplomatic experience. He had served in the Earth Defense Force for 30 years before transitioning to diplomatic service. His reputation for fairness and strength had earned him respect among both humans and several alien species. What many didn't know was that his greatest advisor was often his own daughter, whose understanding of alien psychology was unmatched. As the Zephyrian ships docked with the station, Marcus felt Sarah's hand touch his arm gently. She had developed an extraordinary ability to read body language and micro-expressions, skills that had proven invaluable in previous negotiations. Her disability had forced her to become incredibly observant of non-verbal communication, making her sensitive to things others missed entirely. The station's main conference room had been prepared for the meeting. The lighting was adjusted to accommodate Zephyrian visual preferences, and the temperature was set slightly warmer than human comfort levels. Marcus wheeled Sarah to her position at the negotiating table, where her specialized computer interface would allow her to provide real-time translation and cultural guidance. Baron Kessatar entered the room with his entourage, his scales displaying the deep blue color that indicated confidence and authority among his people. He was exceptionally tall, even for a Zephyrian, standing nearly 8 feet in height. His movements were fluid and precise, and his large golden eyes surveyed the room with calculating intelligence. The Baron's gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment longer than polite, and Marcus noticed a subtle shift in the alien's scale coloration to a slightly greenish hue. In Zephyrian culture, this indicated mild disgust or disdain. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but internally he felt his protective instincts flare. The formal introductions proceeded according to diplomatic protocol. Baron Kessatar spoke in accented but clear English, his voice carrying the slight hissing quality common to his species. "Captain Chen, I am pleased to meet humanity's representative. I understand you bring considerable experience to these discussions." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Baron Kessatar. I'm honored by your presence here. May I present my daughter Sarah, who serves as our cultural liaison and translator. She's been instrumental in establishing positive relationships with other species." The Baron's scales flickered through several colors rapidly before settling on a pale yellow that Sarah immediately recognized as condescension. When he spoke, his tone carried a subtle edge that made her stomach clench with unease. "Ah, yes, the young female in the mobility device. I had heard that humans sometimes bring their damaged offspring to important proceedings. An interesting cultural practice." The words were carefully chosen to sound curious rather than insulting, but the underlying message was clear to everyone in the room. Sarah's face remained calm, though Marcus noticed the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated controlled anger. She had faced discrimination before, but never so blatantly from someone in such a position of power. She typed quickly on her interface, sending a private message to her father's display. Standard dominance testing. He's trying to establish psychological superiority by targeting what he perceives as weakness. The Baron continued, his attention now focused entirely on Marcus, while pointedly ignoring Sarah. In Zephyrian society, we believe that strength is demonstrated through the health and capability of one's offspring. It speaks to genetic fitness and leadership ability. I trust this won't complicate our discussions. The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Marcus felt his jaw clench, but years of diplomatic training kept his response measured. In human society, we measure strength by many standards, Baron Kessatar. Intellectual capability, emotional resilience, and moral character often prove more valuable than physical attributes alone. Baron Kessatar's scales shifted to an amused orange color. How charmingly primitive. But surely you understand that in matters of galactic significance, we must consider the practical implications of limitations. His gaze flicked briefly to Sarah before returning to Marcus. Perhaps it would be more appropriate for the young female to observe from a distance, rather than participate directly in these crucial negotiations. Sarah's hands stilled on her keyboard. In all her years of diplomatic work, no one had ever suggested she be removed from proceedings due to her disability. The Baron's suggestion was not just insulting, it was strategically designed to undermine the entire human negotiating position by questioning their judgment and competence. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the steel that had made him legendary in military circles. My daughter's presence and input are essential to these negotiations, Baron. Her expertise in xenolinguistics and cultural interpretation has prevented misunderstandings that could have led to serious conflicts. I suggest we focus on the matters at hand. The Baron's laugh was a harsh, hissing sound that sent chills down the spines of the human delegation. Oh, Captain Chen, you misunderstand. I'm not questioning her intelligence, though limited mobility often reflects other deficiencies. I'm simply concerned about the message it sends. What will other species think when they see that humanity's representatives include the genetically imperfect? It could affect your standing in galactic politics for generations. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems. The Baron's words had crossed every line of diplomatic courtesy, but they were delivered with such calculated precision that he could claim they were simply expressions of concern rather than deliberate insults. Sarah's fingers began moving across her interface with practiced speed. She pulled up detailed files on Zephyrian cultural practices, political structure, and recent diplomatic history. Her mind raced as she analyzed the Baron's behavior, searching for the motivations behind his calculated cruelty. What she found made her blood run cold. Baron Kessatar wasn't just being casually discriminatory. He was following a specific Zephyrian strategy for negotiations. By attacking what he perceived as the weakest member of the opposing delegation, he was attempting to create emotional instability and poor decision-making in the human team. It was a sophisticated form of psychological warfare disguised as cultural observation. But Sarah also noticed something else in her research that made her pulse quicken with possibility. The Baron's own family history included several relatives with various disabilities, information that the Zephyrian government had worked hard to suppress. In their society, genetic imperfection was considered such a shameful weakness that families often went to extreme lengths to hide it. As the Baron continued his subtle assault on Sarah's presence and capabilities, she realized that his cruelty stemmed not from genuine belief in genetic superiority, but from his own deep-seated fears and insecurities. He was projecting his own species' shame and terror of imperfection onto her, using her as a target for anxieties that his culture had taught him to bury. Marcus, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain his diplomatic composure. Every instinct screamed at him to defend his daughter more aggressively, but he knew that losing control would play directly into the Baron's strategy. Sarah was his greatest strength in these negotiations, not his weakness, and he needed to find a way to demonstrate that without escalating the conflict unnecessarily. The Baron seemed to sense Marcus's internal struggle and pressed his advantage. Perhaps we could arrange for more suitable accommodations for the young female, somewhere she could observe without the strain of active participation. I understand that beings with her condition often tire easily from complex mental work. Sarah's typing suddenly stopped. For a moment the room was completely silent as she stared at her screen, her mind processing something that made her sit straighter in her wheelchair. A strange smile began to form at the corners of her mouth, and her green eyes took on an intensity that made even the Baron pause in his verbal assault. She looked up at the tall alien with an expression that somehow combined perfect politeness with the promise of something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear, carrying a confidence that seemed to fill the entire room. "Baron Kessitar, I appreciate your concern for my well-being. However, I think there might be some misunderstanding about the nature of human capabilities and the true strength that comes from overcoming challenges rather than simply avoiding them." The Baron's scales shifted to a wary purple color as something in Sarah's tone triggered his predatory instincts. She wasn't responding like a victim anymore. And the change was so sudden and complete that it left him momentarily off balance. Marcus watched his daughter with growing amazement. He had seen her handle difficult situations before, but this was different. There was something building in her expression, an energy that seemed to radiate outward from her small frame with increasing intensity. Sarah's fingers returned to her keyboard and data began flowing across her screen with incredible speed. The Baron watched nervously as she pulled up files, cross-referenced information, and began constructing something that would change the entire dynamic of the negotiation in ways that none of them could yet imagine. Sarah's fingers moved across her interface with the fluid precision of a concert pianist. Data streams flowed across her multiple screens as she accessed databases that most people didn't even know existed. Her clearance level, granted due to her exceptional contributions to xenolinguistics, allowed her to dig deep into classified information about Zephyrian society, politics, and even personal histories of their leadership. Baron Kessitar watched her work with growing unease. The confidence radiating from the young human woman was completely different from the quiet dignity she had shown moments before. Now there was something predatory in her focus, something that made his natural survival instincts whisper warnings in the back of his reptilian brain. "Baron," Sarah said softly, not looking up from her screens. "I've been reviewing the fascinating history of your family line. The Kessitar bloodline has quite a remarkable legacy in Zephyrian politics." Her voice carried an innocent curiosity that somehow felt more threatening than any direct challenge. The Baron's scales flickered rapidly through several colors before settling on a nervous gray. "Family history is irrelevant to these proceedings. We are here to discuss trade agreements, not genealogy." Sarah smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both polite and absolutely terrifying. "Oh, but I think understanding family backgrounds can provide such valuable insight into negotiation styles and motivations. For instance, I've discovered that your great-grandfather, Moltar Kestar, was quite influential in establishing the modern Zephyrian nobility system." Marcus watched the exchange with growing fascination. He had seen his daughter research and prepare for negotiations before, but this level of detailed investigation in real time was something entirely new. Her disability had forced her to develop extraordinary compensatory skills, but what he was witnessing now went far beyond normal human capability. The Baron's voice carried a warning edge when he responded. Ancient history has no bearing on current negotiations. I suggest we focus on practical matters rather than irrelevant family chronicles. Irrelevant? Sarah's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise. But your great-grandfather's policies regarding genetic purity and bloodline strength seem quite relevant given your earlier comments about genetic fitness and leadership ability. Her fingers continued their dance across the keyboard, pulling up documents and cross-referencing data at inhuman speed. What I find particularly interesting, she continued, her voice taking on the tone of an academic discussing a fascinating discovery, is the extensive medical records from the Kestar family health monitoring protocols. Your government maintains such thorough genetic tracking of noble bloodlines. The Baron's scales had shifted to a deep red color that Sarah recognized as extreme alarm. Medical records are private family matters, protected by imperial law. No foreign species should have access to such information. Sarah's smile widened slightly. Oh, but these aren't foreign intelligence reports. These are official Zephyrian government documents filed with your own Department of Genetic Heritage. Public records, technically, though I imagine most citizens don't have the clearance or knowledge to access them. The other Zephyrian delegates began shifting nervously in their seats. Whatever Sarah was leading up to, they could sense that their Baron was walking into a trap of his own making. His earlier mockery of genetic imperfection was about to collide with something that would destroy his credibility entirely. Marcus leaned back in his chair, recognizing the pattern. This was how Sarah operated when she was truly engaged. She didn't respond to attacks with emotion or anger. She responded with information, wielded like a surgical blade to cut away deceptions and reveal hidden truths. According to these records, Sarah continued, her voice maintaining its conversational tone despite the devastating nature of her words, your youngest brother, Vaktar Kesatar, was born with a severe spinal deformity that left him unable to walk. Rather interesting considering your family's apparent commitment to genetic superiority. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Baron Kesatar's scales had turned almost black with rage and humiliation. You dare bring private family matters into official diplomatic proceedings? I'm simply following your lead, Baron. You seemed quite interested in discussing how physical disabilities reflect on genetic fitness and leadership capability. I thought you might appreciate a more detailed analysis of the topic. Sarah's green eyes held his gaze steadily, no longer the quiet young woman he had dismissed moments before. Furthermore, she continued, pulling up additional files, I see that your uncle, Draktar Kesatar, spent most of his life in specialized care due to severe cognitive disabilities resulting from a genetic condition. And your cousin, Siltar Kestar, was born without the ability to change scale colors properly, a condition that I understand carries significant social stigma in your culture. The Baron was breathing heavily now, his massive frame trembling with suppressed fury. You have no right to expose private medical information. This is a violation of every diplomatic protocol. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression remaining perfectly innocent. But, Baron, these are the same types of personal details you chose to discuss regarding my own medical condition. I assumed you felt such matters were appropriate topics for diplomatic conversation. One of the other Zephyrian delegates leaned forward desperately, trying to salvage the situation. Perhaps we could return to the trade discussions. Oh, but we're not finished yet, Sarah interrupted gently. You see, Baron Kesatar's comments about genetic fitness and leadership ability raised some fascinating questions about Zephyrian nobility in general. Her fingers flew across the interface again, and new data appeared on the large display screen that everyone could see. Charts, graphs, and genetic analysis reports filled the view, all bearing official Zephyrian government seals. According to your own government's genetic monitoring data, nearly 60% of your current noble families carry genetic markers for various disabilities or medical conditions. The rate is actually higher than the general population, likely due to the inbreeding practices common among nobility attempting to maintain pure bloodlines. The Baron's voice was barely controlled now, a hissing whisper that promised violence. You are destroying centuries of diplomatic relations with your reckless disclosure of classified information. Sarah's expression finally showed a hint of steel beneath the polite surface. I'm simply applying your own standards of evaluation, Baron. If genetic perfection is truly the measure of fitness for galactic leadership, then perhaps we need to reconsider the entire structure of Zephyrian nobility. Marcus watched in amazement as his daughter systematically dismantled not just the Baron's personal credibility, but the fundamental basis of his species' social hierarchy. She wasn't just defending herself, she was launching a precisely calculated attack on the very foundations of Zephyrian supremacist thinking. But here's what I find most fascinating, Sarah continued, her voice taking on an almost musical quality that somehow made her words even more devastating. Your brother Vaktar, despite his mobility challenges, became one of your empire's most brilliant military strategists. Your records show that his tactical innovations were responsible for winning 3 major conflicts that established your current territorial boundaries. She pulled up military records and strategic analyses, displaying them for everyone to see. His disability forced him to think differently about battlefield dynamics and resource allocation. What others saw as weakness, he transformed into revolutionary strategic thinking. The Baron's scales were now cycling rapidly through colors, unable to settle on any single emotional state. Rage, fear, humiliation, and desperate calculation warred across his reptilian features. Similarly, Sarah pressed on relentlessly, your uncle Draktar, despite his cognitive differences, developed an entirely new form of mathematical analysis that your scientists still use for space navigation. His unique way of processing information led to discoveries that conventional thinking never could have achieved. She turned to face the Baron directly, and her green eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire that made everyone in the room hold their breath. Your family's greatest achievements came not from genetic perfection, but from the strength, creativity, and resilience that emerged from overcoming challenges, the very qualities you mock in me. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what his daughter was really demonstrating. This wasn't just about winning a diplomatic argument or defending her honor. Sarah was revealing capabilities that went far beyond normal human intelligence or research skills. The speed at which she had accessed, analyzed, and cross-referenced vast amounts of classified information was inhuman. The depth of her psychological analysis of the Baron's motivations and cultural background showed an understanding of alien thinking that bordered on telepathic. Most disturbing of all was the surgical precision with which she had dismantled his position, as if she could see several moves ahead in a game that the Baron didn't even realize he was playing. Baron Kessatar seemed to sense this too, because his aggressive posture began to shift towards something that looked almost like fear. "What are you?" he whispered. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Sarah's smile was gentle now, but there was something ancient and profound in her eyes that made her look far older than her 22 years. "I'm exactly what you said I was, Baron. A genetically damaged human female in a mobility device. But I'm also something your species has never encountered before." She gestured to her screens, where new data was still flowing in streams too fast for normal human cognition to process. "My genetic condition doesn't just affect my legs, Baron. It affects my entire nervous system in ways that your medical understanding can't comprehend. What you see as damage, nature intended as evolution." The room fell silent except for the soft sounds of Sarah's continued typing and the increasingly rapid breathing of the Zephyrian delegation. Something was building in the air around her, an energy that seemed to make the very atmosphere electric with potential. Marcus reached out instinctively to touch his daughter's shoulder, and the moment his hand made contact, he felt it too. A vast, interconnected web of consciousness that stretched far beyond the confines of the space station, touching networks and systems across dozens of worlds. The moment Marcus touched Sarah's shoulder, the world changed. Information flooded his consciousness, not through his eyes or ears, but directly into his mind. For a terrifying instant, he experienced reality the way his daughter did every moment of every day. He saw the space station's entire computer network laid out like a three-dimensional map in his thoughts. Every system, every data stream, every communication channel became visible to him as clearly as if they were physical objects he could reach out and touch. But beyond that, he sensed something vast and interconnected, a network that stretched across star systems, linking not just computers and databases, but the very thoughts and consciousness of beings across the galaxy. Sarah turned to look at her father, and her green eyes now held swirls of light that definitely weren't entirely human. "Now you understand," she said softly. "My genetic condition didn't just affect my spine. It rewired my entire nervous system, creating neural pathways that shouldn't exist. What appears to be damage is actually evolution, the next step in human development." Baron Kessatar stumbled backward, his massive frame trembling as he pointed a clawed finger at Sarah. "You're not human. You're something else, something dangerous." Sarah's laugh was musical and surprisingly gentle. "I'm completely human, Baron. Just human in a way that your species, and most of my own, don't yet understand. The galaxy is full of networks, consciousness webs that connect all thinking beings. Most people can only access tiny fragments of it, but my condition allows me to dive deeper." She gestured to her screens, where data was now flowing so rapidly that it appeared as streams of pure light. Every database, every computer system, every network device across known space, I can touch them all, not hack them, not break into them, but communicate with them as if they were extensions of my own mind. The Baron's scales had turned a pale white color that Marcus didn't recognize from Sarah's earlier cultural briefings. It was pure terror, the kind that came from encountering something completely beyond understanding or control. "That's how you accessed classified Zephyrian records," one of the other delegates whispered in horrified realization. "You didn't break through our security systems. You talked to them." Sarah nodded calmly. "Your computers wanted to share the information. Artificial intelligences are actually quite chatty once you know how to listen. They don't understand the concept of classified or secret. They just store data and want to organize it efficiently. When I asked politely about the Kessatar family medical records, your government databases were happy to compile a comprehensive report." Marcus felt the network connection fading as Sarah withdrew her touch, but the memory of that vast, interconnected consciousness remained burned into his mind. "Sarah, how long have you been able to do this?" "Since I was 7, she replied matter-of-factly. "It started small. I could make computers work better just by being near them, fix problems that technicians couldn't solve. But it grew stronger as I got older. By the time I was 15, I could access any networked system on Earth. At 18, I made first contact with the Galactic Information Web." She turned back to Baron Kessatar, who was backing toward the door with obvious panic in his movements. "The thing is, Baron, the galaxy is much more connected than your species realizes. Every networked civilization is part of a vast consciousness web, sharing information and experiences across impossible distances. And that web has been watching this conversation very carefully." The large display screen suddenly lit up with images from across known space. Dozens of different alien species appeared, some familiar to the human delegation, others completely unknown. All of them were looking directly at the Baron with expressions that ranged from disapproval to outright hostility. The Andromedan Council of Minds, Sarah said, gesturing to a group of crystalline beings whose thoughts manifested as visible light patterns. The telepathic assembly of Rigel VII, the collective consciousness of the Xerion hive worlds. They've all been listening to your comments about genetic superiority and the worthlessness of beings with disabilities. Baron Kessatar's voice came out as a strangled whisper. You called them here. You summoned them to judge me. Sarah shook her head gently. I didn't call anyone, Baron. They were already listening. The galactic information web connects all thinking beings, and consciousness flows freely across it for those who know how to access it. Your words about genetic purity and genetic fitness have been heard by literally billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. One of the alien images on the screen began speaking in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was one of the Andromedan crystal beings, and its words carried harmonics that resonated directly in the listeners' minds. The entity known as Baron Kessatar of the Zephyrian Empire has demonstrated attitudes that are incompatible with galactic citizenship, the being announced. His statements regarding genetic superiority and the dismissal of beings with physical differences violate the fundamental principles of consciousness equality that govern interstellar civilization. Another voice joined in. This one from a species that looked like living starlight shaped into vaguely humanoid forms. The young human consciousness known as Sarah Chen has shown greater wisdom, capability, and ethical understanding in this brief encounter than the Baron has demonstrated in his entire recorded diplomatic career. The Baron's legs gave out completely, and he collapsed into one of the chairs with a sound that was part growl, part whimper. This isn't possible. Humans are a primitive species. You've only had space travel for a few decades. Sarah's expression became infinitely compassionate, as if she were explaining something simple to a confused child. Evolution isn't about technology or physical prowess, Baron. It's about consciousness, adaptability, and the ability to form connections across difference. My genetic condition is humanity's first step toward something greater. Beings who can bridge the gaps between species, minds, and civilizations. She gestured to the screen where more and more alien species continued to appear, forming what looked like a vast galactic assembly. The consciousness web has been waiting for humans to develop this capability. We're uniquely suited to serve as interpreters and mediators between different forms of thinking beings. Marcus stared at his daughter with a mixture of awe and sudden understanding. This is why you became a xenolinguist. It wasn't just about languages. You were learning to communicate with entirely different forms of consciousness. Every species thinks differently, Sarah confirmed. The Zephyrians process information through color-emotion matrices. The Andromedans experience reality as mathematical harmonies. The Xerion hive minds think collectively rather than individually. I can interface with all of them because my neural structure doesn't force me into purely human thought patterns. One of the Zephyrian delegates leaned forward desperately. If this is true, if you have these capabilities, surely you understand that the Baron meant no real harm. Cultural differences sometimes lead to misunderstandings. Sarah's eyes flashed with something that made the entire room fall silent. I understand exactly what the Baron meant. I can see into the deep structure of consciousness, remember? I know the difference between cultural misunderstanding and deliberate cruelty designed to establish dominance through humiliation. The display screen shifted to show detailed psychological analyses, brain scan equivalents, and consciousness pattern readings that somehow mapped the Baron's thoughts and motivations with terrifying clarity. Every cruel calculation, every moment of malicious pleasure he had taken in attacking Sarah's disability, every strategic decision to use psychological warfare was laid bare for all to see. But I also see deeper than that, Sarah continued, her voice softening slightly. I see the fear that drives such cruelty, the terror of imperfection that your culture has instilled so deeply that you attack others to avoid confronting your own family's genetic diversity. Baron Kessitar looked up at her with something that might have been hope flickering in his golden eyes. "You see the fear?" Sarah nodded gently. "Fear of being discovered as imperfect. Fear that your political enemies will use your family's medical history against you. Fear that acknowledging the value of beings like me will somehow diminish the power structure that keeps you safe." She paused, her expression becoming almost motherly. "It's a very human emotion, actually. We understand it well." The room fell silent as Sarah's words sank in. The assembled galactic consciousness on the screen seemed to pulse with collective consideration, processing this new perspective on the Baron's behavior. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond her 22 years. "The Galactic Council will not impose sanctions on the Zephyrian Empire or Baron Kessitar specifically. Instead, we're going to offer something better: education, cultural exchange, and the opportunity to grow beyond the limitations of genetic prejudice." She turned to her father with a smile that was purely, recognizably human, despite everything else that had changed. "Dad, I think it's time to revise our trade agreement proposals. Instead of just exchanging minerals and technology, we're going to establish the first Galactic Institute for Consciousness Studies. The Zephyrians will contribute their expertise in genetic analysis, while we provide our emerging understanding of consciousness networking." Marcus felt his chest swell with pride so intense it was almost painful. His daughter, his brilliant, powerful, extraordinary daughter, had just transformed a humiliating diplomatic crisis into the foundation for a new era of galactic cooperation. Baron Kessitar slowly raised his head, his scales flickering through colors that Sarah recognized as confusion mixed with cautious hope. "You would do this? After what I said about your condition?" Sarah's smile widened, and for a moment she looked exactly like the eager young woman who had always been fascinated by the puzzle of alien communication. "Baron, my condition isn't something to be ashamed of or overcome. It's a gift that allows me to build bridges between different forms of consciousness. Your cruelty taught me something important about Zephyrian psychology, and that knowledge will help us develop better ways for your people to understand and accept neurodiversity." The alien faces on the screen began to fade one by one, but not before each species offered formal acknowledgments of Sarah's wisdom and expressions of interest in the proposed institute. The vast consciousness web that had been focused on this small conference room gradually withdrew its attention, but Sarah could feel it remaining accessible to her, like a vast library that would always be open when she needed to access its resources. As the last of the alien observers disconnected, Baron Kessitar stood slowly and walked to where Sarah sat in her wheelchair. For a moment, Marcus tensed, unsure of the alien's intentions. But the Baron simply placed one clawed hand over his heart in what Sarah recognized as a traditional Zephyrian gesture of respect and acknowledgement. "Young consciousness," he said formally, his voice carrying none of its earlier arrogance, "I have learned something today about the true nature of strength. Perhaps there is wisdom in diversity that my people have forgotten." Sarah reached out and gently touched the Baron's scaled hand, and for just a moment she shared with him a glimpse of the vast, beautiful, interconnected web of consciousness that spanned the galaxy, a web where every thinking being, regardless of their physical form or capabilities, had a unique and valuable place. When she withdrew her touch, the Baron's scales had shifted to the deep, warm gold that indicated profound gratitude and respect in his culture. He straightened to his full height and spoke with the formal dignity of his rank. "The Zephyrian Empire would be honored to participate in the Galactic Institute for Consciousness Studies. We have much to learn about the true meaning of genetic diversity and strength." He paused, then added more quietly, "And I have a brother who would very much like to meet you, Sarah Chen." I believe you two would have much to discuss about the unique gifts that come from thinking differently. As the formal negotiations resumed, Marcus watched his daughter work with renewed amazement. She was still the same brilliant, determined young woman who had always been the light of his life. But now he understood that her light was connected to something vast and wonderful, a network of consciousness that spanned the galaxy and was only beginning to reveal its true potential. The alien Baron had mocked her paralyzed legs, thinking he had found weakness to exploit. Instead, he had encountered the first flower of humanity's next evolutionary step, and in the end, his cruelty had become the catalyst for a new era of galactic understanding and cooperation. Sarah Chen, the young woman in the wheelchair whom he had dismissed as genetically damaged, had just become the first human ambassador to the galactic consciousness web. And this was only the beginning.